right, well, we're going to get started. I'm going to introduce our speaker today. Today we have Melissa Murphy, and Melissa, thank you for coming. Innovative, forward-thinking, and solution-focused, Melissa Murphy is a nationally recognized and award-winning leader committed to building and transforming brands and organizations. Melissa's vast experience boasts an impressive list of companies and campaigns with worldwide recognition, including StarKist, Del Monte Foods, and Heinz. Throughout the years, she has impressively fashioned numerous award-winning branding and social media campaigns, championed employee management and communications to build brand internally and improve morale and employee satisfaction, managed numerous industry and company crises and issues, spearheaded communications efforts for a myriad of corporate initiatives, including restructuring and change management, earnings and M&A, facilitated planning sessions for business, marketing, and communication strategies, as well as conducted off-site meetings for clients, partnered with local, state, and national elected officials to promote various legislative positions, fostered corporate giving policies, implemented community outreach programs, and has served on several nonprofit boards. And Melissa, we'll let you get started.
That is quite an introduction. I'm happy to be here today. Thanks, Allison. If you're on the line, I would love it if you turn your camera on just so I can see your faces to see if what I'm saying is connecting, making sense. I would love for you to ask questions as well. I don't want this to be a formal presentation. I would love this to be informal and asking questions along the way. I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, so don't worry about that. But I would like us to have more of a conversation than a pure sort of lecture. Allison gave an overview of my career, and I think the headline for that is simply, I've worn many hats and been responsible for many things in my past corporate life. The last 10 years, I've actually started my own consulting company, and I am an adjunct at Tepper. So I teach both marketing courses as well as new product management and product management courses. So if you are taking courses in Mini 3, new product management, I teach 2 sections of that. And I also teach the Corporate Startup Lab capstone. So just a plug for those if you have more information. And when we're done today, I'll actually stay on the line a little bit. So if you've got a question you're uncomfortable sharing in the group setting, I'll be available for a few minutes afterward as well. So hopefully you find this informative and some good information, and we can have a conversation about it. I'm going to switch now to share my screen. I will walk you through a presentation that I have and pause a lot along the way to see if there are questions, see if there's more information, and we'll take it from there. So let's get started. Allison, help me if there's questions or comments that come up in the chat. If you could keep an eye on that for me, that would be great.
Sure.
I thought I was on the first slide. It's back to the beginning here. Okay, so what we're here to talk about today is really pitching innovation to the C-suite. The work that I do with the Corporate Startup Lab takes a look at how we bring startup mentality, startup innovation, entrepreneurial spirit into a larger corporate setting. So this part of the presentation really is dealing with how do we pitch innovation to the leaders in the company. And we'll talk a little bit about how that's different from a traditional entrepreneurial role and setting. It's not good or bad, but it is different. So I want to call some of that out. The other lens I think you can look through this entire presentation on is pitching businesses to VCs and potential financial investors, because they ask a lot of the same type of questions. And I think the process you go through as an intrapreneur to prepare for speaking to executives and how a traditional entrepreneur speaks to VCs, there's a similar process there, even though the audiences may be different. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of that as well. So just a little setup regarding the Corporate Startup Lab. Hopefully you've attended some of the other Connects and heard some speakers. I know Sean has been part of it. Laura Barkman also did as well. And I think they covered different phases of the process. Lori covered project framing, which is about the corporate startup and the canvas and idea development, so the early stages of the process. Sean is really great at talking about building maps, which is his version of an MVP, so it's the awesome product, talking about customer discovery and validation. And then sort of the final piece of the puzzle is this pitching the innovation or pitching your idea or product to the C-suite, or as I said, this could also be investors or VCs. So my personal philosophy, and then I'll tell you what sort of is the reality of it's out there. So I have a bias because I've done a lot of M&A, a lot of earnings related communication, a lot of financial communication that would say you should rarely, if ever, be surprised by questions, particularly from an executive or from a board of directors or a VC for that matter. You may not always have an answer, but you shouldn't be surprised by the questions. You should always be preparing and going through your presentations and preparing for them. Part of that process that's really critical is thinking about the types of questions that you're going to ask, who's going to ask them, what their agenda is, and what expertise do they have that you don't have that they may try and drill down on a little bit. So we'll talk about that. But personal philosophy is you should never be surprised by the question, even if you don't have the answer. And we'll talk about that a little bit at the end about what to do when there's a question, you expect it and you don't have the answer and how to handle that. But that will come at the end. Now, the reality of it is, though, that when we're talking about pitching innovation, the most common complaint coming from corporate intrapreneurs is really about being blindsided by questions. So that says to me that you were probably rushing to do a presentation, you were putting, dotting I's and crossing T's and doing more testing and iterating, but you weren't thinking about the presentation itself. Now, what I'm talking about isn't necessarily a guideline for giving presentations, but it's about being prepared for the presentations. So part of that is understanding the types of questions that you're going to ask and coming up with tools and resources to help you better prepare for those interactions so that you're not blindsided. There's nothing worse than being blindsided. It shows on your face, it shows on your eyes. There's always that pause that comes with it. So our goal is to make you feel that, not be blindsided by that and be prepared with that. And like I said, personally, this is a big deal to me and something I spend a lot of time on for myself, but also with my clients as well in preparing for that. Different from a corporate perspective, different from the traditional entrepreneurial perspective, when you pitch innovation at the C-suite level, you're probably speaking with 5, 6, 7 people that have various backgrounds and various different expertises. So they have different agendas. They're in the room for a different reason sometimes. So you have to be prepared for that. It also it forces you to be have a broader base of Q&A to be prepared for. I think if you're meeting with a VC and you're meeting with 1 or 2 people, you know their history, you know their background, you know the types of organizations they work with, you can anticipate a little bit more what the question is. But when you've got 6 or 7 people from different functional areas of expertise with different agendas, it becomes more challenging with that. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And the tool that I'll introduce you to that we've created is called the C-Suite Canvas. And I will walk you through that in a couple slides. Any comments or questions yet? All right. So one of the things to think about when doing this is thinking about sort of the key communication challenges that you deal with. So from a corporate perspective, one of the hardest things that we deal with is defending ideas in the very early stages of presentations. Corporate entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs have to defend ideas from day one. And often there is an ability to kill the idea day one if for some reason some part of the company isn't supportive of that. So I think the notion of defending ideas, being prepared for those tough, big, high-level questions is particularly important. Not to say that the traditional entrepreneurial is easier. Again, these are differences. It's not a better, worse, or easier, harder. They're just differences in how they operate. So I think VCs are a little more tolerant of early stage ideas and willing to sort of hear you out and get some information. Corporate's not always that willing to go through that. I think on the corporate side of it, there's also the lower tolerance for error. And this is what I was alluding to a minute ago, where I mentioned that in the corporate setting, you're pitching to 5 or 6 people. They control everything. They control the budgets. They control who's on the teams. They control what ideas move forward and what don't. When they say no, you have run out of options. You don't have the ability to pitch it to somebody else in the company or take it somewhere else. You're really stuck with that group. Whereas opposed to a traditional entrepreneurial environment, if you have a bad experience, you don't connect, you have the opportunity to move on to other VCs for it. So there's a lower tolerance for error, particularly in the early stages for that corporate entrepreneur. So getting those early building blocks of innovation and product development are critical at that stage of the game. The other part of it that can be a little bit different too on the corporate side is, those 5 or 6 people that I keep referring to that are in the room, and we'll actually map that out on the canvas, is they're all coming from different vertical areas probably. They've probably worked their way up and they might be, senior vice presidents of something, but the reality is they started in finance, they started in legal, they started in R&D, they started in marketing, and they, just like all of us, have their own core areas of comfort and expertise. And you can pretty much count on that when it comes to giving presentations and situations. Most people revert to what they're comfortable with. So you as the presenter, this is where it's better to prepare the questions, because we all have our weaknesses. Some people are stronger when it comes to finance. Some are better at selling the idea. Some are better at sharing and supporting the data. So it's important to understand your strengths and weaknesses and prepare in a way that makes you feel comfortable in those areas that you may not be as strong in, because you're probably going to get questions on them. So the solution that we've come up with, or really I should say Sean has come up with, is the pitching innovation to the C-suite. And I'm going to show it to you and talk about it at a high level. And then I'm actually going to exit out of the presentation and share with you the document and show you how it works in a little bit more detail for that. And the reason that this was created was for this exact reason of, okay, who are those core audience, core constituents that could be in the room? And at a bottom line, what are the key questions they may be asking? And we'll walk through some of those in a second. So one of the things about tools that I think is a good thing is when they're used properly. And when they're being used properly, it's something that you refer to often and you update it and it becomes a working document. So that's what the goal of the Canvas is really to be a good starting place, but also something that you can use throughout the process to sort of track your progress and refer back to on information for that. So it allows you to track your iterations, your insights, feedback from your end user or target audience. It's a good place to call out the gaps. And the reason that part I think works really well is sometimes we think as entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs, our idea is to sell. When you're dealing with a corporate C-suite presentation, a little salesmanship helps, but if it feels like it's coming on too strong or too much, or isn't looking at the full picture, you'll probably get some really difficult questions. So I always encourage that people go in with a more neutral mindset and a more open mindset in terms of what the strengths and weaknesses are of what you're doing, where the gaps are, what you're going to work on next, and try to do that. And I think this tool is a good way to do that and sort of keep you on track of, okay, here's where we are today. Here's those couple key areas we know we'll get questions about and that we think are important in moving forward. And generally, the other piece of advice I give, and we'll talk a little bit more about this at the very end, is understanding who you're speaking with. Of course, the target audience is important, but sometimes in the room, in the corporate setting, people have very different points of view. They might be a friend, they might be supportive of what we're doing, they might be a foe against the initiative because it competes with something they're working on. The more you know about who you're speaking to, the better you can anticipate the questions and determine who they are and how to prepare for the presentation. Nothing's worse than going into a room knowing that there's someone in there that's just ready to really pick it apart. And sadly, that happens more often than not. So being prepared for that and sort of the loudest voice in the room or the biggest foe in the room is really good preparation. So a key part of the Canvas, and I'll show you this over 3 slides, and then we can sort of pull up the actual document itself, is breaking it down by areas of expertise. So here we see a section about knowing your audience. So things that we look at are the CEO, so the Chief Executive Officer. What's their goal? What do they want to hear? What are they going to really push hard on? The same thing can be said for the Chief Marketing Officer, the Chief Legal Officer, who's always going to push back. A very important part of the team, but typically will push back on you. The Chief Technology Officer, Financial Officer, and the Chief Operating Officer. All of these functions are critical to you getting your product to the marketplace. So getting the buy-in, getting their expertise, understanding their worlds a little bit helps with that. So the Canvas is actually 2-sided. So this first hat we talk about are thinking hats, and it looks at these different roles and questions they may ask. And I'll pull it up in detail in 1 second so we can look at it. But it breaks those down and it gives you space to add questions in. Documents like this are only as good as the information that's put into them. And they're also, we encourage people to really customize them. So you know that if you're in a company doing innovation work, you're probably going to get a lot of the same questions regardless of what the product is. So starting to understand that and build that and be ready for that diversity in the questions is a really important part. And this is a good tool for that. The backside of it is instructions on how to do it. So there's detail on it, gives you ideas, really valuable tool. And let me pull up the actual document for a second. I just do this because it lets us see a little bit better for it. Let me get this centered a little bit. So if we take a look at the different hats on it, so we have the CMO hat here. Here are some of the questions that go with that. What's the target market? How do I overlap with our existing markets in the company? What kind of channels and communications would be required? What ideas fit with the existing brand and reputation? What would failure mean to our existing brands? So one of the things from the corporate perspective is you're never working in a vacuum. You're always looking at that broader portfolio. You're also looking at those broader expectations, particularly if you're a publicly held company. And so understanding that is an important part of it. Base question for those that don't have a marketing background, and really critical, and probably something you all already know, but it's really understanding your audience. Who are they? What do they want? Where is their pain point? How does your product help that piece of it? And understanding some of those basics. Those are some things we might expect from a CMO. Now, if we, sorry, here, let me get this. So if we have the COO hat, how might this integrate with existing processes and systems, workflow? COOs are also good at looking at priorities. Are we doing things with the same priorities? We don't want to be splitting our efforts too much. How will this impact our culture? Do we have the right core competencies to execute this? Is it something we should be buying versus creating? Is it something we should be partnering or co-producing with someone for it? They're really going to get into the technical operations side of it and really look at, can we do this? And it sounds like a really basic question. Of course, people should think about it, but I think there are a bit of delusions of grandeur when companies think about going outside of their core categories. They have a tendency to think of, well, yeah, we can figure that out. We know that. What they typically aren't accounting for is the competition in those categories and how well they already know the market, how well their customers already know it, and really trying to understand that piece of it. So all very important parts to it. The CEO hat. Does your idea fit with the long-term direction of the company? Will it cannibalize our existing products and markets? A really important question and a good one to understand. Does it make us a better company? Is it adding value to it? Does it fit within our culture, our values? Does this make sense within our 3 to 5 year roadmap? How does this add to that as opposed to deter from it or take away from it, or simply just not be a good fit? What's the potential for the idea? So one of the things CEOs typically like to see and get lots of questions on are expectations of how the product will perform. What I tell everyone there is always be prepared with high, medium, and low expectations for it, because if you go in with one number, they absolutely will always question it. So always give a range. If there's marketplace conditions that can impact something, that's a good place to call it out. But really give a range of what performance looks like and what are those drivers that affect that performance. That's something a CEO most certainly will be looking forward to hearing more about. Legal, obviously risk is a huge part of that. They're going to be wondering, how are our competitors already doing it? Are we copying technology? Do we expect any legal issues? Are there any unknowns that we might deal with? And I know lots of folks will say, legal, we have to deal with them. We do it later in the process. I honestly believe bringing in your biggest foes or your biggest roadblocks into the process earlier is a better way to do it. I think it gives you a better end product. It creates buy-in, and it also gives you a heads up to where their concerns are and what areas to focus on. Doesn't mean you have to do everything they tell you to do, but I think their input can be really valuable. And I would look at all of these functional areas as partners for that. We also see the CTO hat, again, kind of with, sorry, let me get over to that. The CTO, I put that very similar to the COO, depending upon what type of product it is, but it comes down to, is this feasible? A CTO may ask questions about, the build, borrow, buy, similar to a COO might do, and being prepared for those questions is an important part. And I've built in some questions here related to short-term and long-term. CFO is definitely, and actually I kind of believe that all of these will be looking at the short-term wins, opportunities, and costs, and then also the long-term play for it. One of the biggest challenges in pitching innovation in a corporate setting is actually the finance department. And again, a wonderful, important partner in the process, especially if that's not your core area of expertise. I don't want to fight with finance. I'm going to bring them in and make them a strong partner and have them help me as opposed to work against me for it. So understanding both short-term and long-term, what their expectations are, what numbers, sort of how their numbers compare to other projects in the company. They can be a huge source of knowledge if you ask the right people and ask the right questions in advance. I think it can be super helpful for that. And then we've got long-term on here. What might the cost looks like? When do we break even? When do we make money on it? Do we need additional resources? What's the trajectory of the marketplace for it? And looking at some of those big questions. And what I tell folks in doing the Canvas is, again, you don't have to have all the answers, but this is a good place to sort of park all the big questions so that when you present, you can prepare a little bit more for that. When I showed you on the PowerPoint, the other thing that there was on a back on the instructions. I'm not going to go through that because I pretty much walked you through all parts of that. But they're there in writing as well, so you need them. So I think that as you think through this, it's important to use it to identify the executive audience, look at who are those key stakeholders, who are those key decision makers, what are they most concerned about. In a corporate setting, not only are you presenting to the executives, you're probably presenting to the board of directors of the company as well, as innovation is a big part of typically board of director approvals, and it's where the growth is projected to come from. So they definitely take a greater interest on that. So understanding those types of questions and what you might ask are important. I always tell everyone who looks at this, if you're working on it and you have ideas, pass them along. This is a living, breathing document that we use to help prepare ourselves and others for presentations. So it's important that if there's things that jump out to you in a good way or a bad way, that you share those with us. We're always interested in hearing them. And my final piece that I kind of want to talk about is, and I referenced this on I think the first or the second slide. My other advice related to pitching to C-suites or again, VCs is the more pre-selling that you can do of your idea, the better you will be. And that can be formally in one-on-one meetings. It can be informally. I had a client years ago that I learned a really valuable lesson from. It was a consortium of industry executives, and it was only 3 companies, and they despised one another. So if you brought up anything to them in the meeting, they would shoot it down because the other company supports it. And I learned a very, very valuable lesson in pre-selling and meeting with people one-on-one and getting their feedback and getting that buy-in. And it can be formally done or informally done. The sooner you pull people in, the more information you have on what they might ask, but the more likely you will to have their buy-in on it. So you should never go into a meeting not knowing the audience and not being familiar with the types of questions that they have asked. And if you have the ability to have a conversation with them early and often, I would do that, even if it's brief, just to hear what the hot buttons are for it. I went through that quickly, I know. I'm hoping that we've got some time to talk about it a little bit more, see what the questions are. It's interesting to note that even outside the innovation world, I still use this template, and I also still do it for meetings with new clients, because that's what it comes down to often, is asking the right questions, and not knowing all the answers sometimes is okay. The one thing I mentioned early on too was how to handle that when you have questions that you may or may not have the answer to. So just like for all communications related activities, when you don't have the answer, you at least give a process update. So we know what the question is, we're familiar with it, we will answer that in the next week, next month, the next quarter. Here's how we're going about to get that information. So be ready for the question, give the process update, and be good with that. The other mistake I see made often is answering and feeling like you always have to answer. I think it's really important that if you get a question you don't know the answer to, and that did catch you off guard, is to say, hey, can we take this offline? Let me get back to you. Let me do a little bit of research on that. We did think about it, but we would like to do even more. And really looking at using that as a jumping off point for a future conversation or a follow-up from the meeting that you're doing. I'm going to stop sharing for a second, so hopefully I can see some faces on the screen, and have a little bit of time to talk about Q&A. I'm going to open it up there. I hope there are questions. If not, I'll probably still keep talking because I'm pretty comfortable on this topic, but I would love to hear from you and love to hear your thoughts and worries, concerns, or anything else. Any questions? Come on, turn your cameras on, ask a few questions, interact. What do you have? And I'll give you a little bit of a story while you're thinking of coming up with your good questions for me. That's what you should be doing. Is last year during our corporate startup lab, and granted we had COVID happen right in the middle of that, so there was a lot of chaos going on. So much time was spent on coming up with the idea and the product that the back end of the process got a little rushed. And what happens when that does happen is this is the part of the exercise that you don't do. You run out of time, so you don't have time to think or anticipate or plan for what the questions may be. And it's really an unfortunate way to do it because you've put so much work into it. You don't want to lose the partner, the investor, the executive because you couldn't answer a question right, or you were blindsided and you sort of panicked and you let that show a little bit. So I don't care what time of the night it is, what time of the day it is, always prepare, always make time to prepare and think about the questions that you're going to get. That's the most interesting part of any meeting, in my opinion, is the questions that come from it. I know from years of doing analyst calls that the first part of the call is always scripted. Well, that's lovely. That's what the company wants to say. The really juicy part, the best part of those conversations were the Q&A, because that's when that really showed if someone knew what they were talking about or not. So when you're presenting innovation, again, in the corporate setting or even to VCs, that Q&A session is critical because it shows how comfortable you are with your content, that you've thought of things, that you're good on your feet. So definitely always make time to think about that. And hopefully you can find the tool is a useful way to do that. Questions, comments? Anything unrelated to the topic? I think someone, Allison, can you pull up the chat? I think someone's posting in that.
Yeah, I have a question. Does the canvas change if my customers are public entities, i.e. governments?
I think the purpose of the canvas is to work for the environment that you're in. So I would say if you're working with governments, I might customize it a little bit differently. But the idea behind thinking about all the parties that are part of the decision-making process, who are they, what are their questions, is still the same exercise. It just, we might change the titles for those. And it can really work in startup, it can work in corporate, it can work in government, it can work in B2B, it can work in consumer. But the real art of it is, I don't want this to come out wrong, but a tool is just a tool. That's all it is. It's really what you do with it. So I would say in the case of governments, okay, who are your top 5 to 7 influencers or decision makers, and then create boxes based on those. I think there's room there to customize it. To me, it's a good place to start, but it's certainly not going to solve problems. You've got to put some time and energy into it and customize it. One of the good parts about the corporate side is, regardless of the product, the questions are usually the same. So once you've invested your time into this and gone through this process of presenting it, normally you can build a pretty substantial base of Q&A up. At least the questions, so they're not being surprised or there aren't gaps in your presentation. You learn pretty quickly how to better anticipate the people and the questions with it. So I think it comes down to customizing it though for it. So I think it can work for anybody. It just may need a little bit of nuance on who those decision makers might be. More questions? I think I see a hand up. I think you're muted.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Perfect.
Perfect. Thank you. So I have been to the situation that one senior executive start to ask one question or had some doubts about your idea, and then someone else just followed up. And then like at some point I start to feel like I'm losing the battle. I'm not able to defend myself, and the conversation is going to the direction that the board is trying to kill the idea. So if I start to sense something like that, what is a good way to kind of pulling this back? Or should I stop the conversation, talk about something else? Or how can I save myself from being, the idea being killed?
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the important things, and it's a really good question, because you're absolutely right. It does happen. And there's probably someone in the room who's not on your side, who's not a full advocate of it. I like to take those people head on, one-on-one before the meeting. And so at least I know what their agenda is and what their points are so that I can address them. I think that's important. The one thing that I think, we had a CEO that I used to work with that we used to laugh because we would have a 2-hour meeting, we would produce 60 slides and we'd have an appendix of another 50, and we would literally get through like 2 slides because he would just sidetrack the whole conversation. It wasn't bad, but it was hard to keep him focused on the topics at hand. So one of the things that we always did was, actually, we had a slide in the deck that if it started going sideways, that we would put that up, and that would sort of be big picture roadmap, to try and get the focus back where you want it to be for that. So always think, yes, it's great to have 50 or 60 slides, but there's going to be a point where it goes from a presentation to a discussion and people are talking. So what is that one slide that you want to have up that's sort of your fallback? So it's not necessarily even you saying it. Here's what our information says. Here's what our data says. Here's what our outside sources say. And that tell the whole story on a slide, because you easily can get derailed and you don't get through, 3/4 of your slides. I wish I had $1 for every time that happened. And so we got smarter about how we presented it so that we had a slide that we could always bring the conversation back around to. And sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work, but always be prepared for that one slide that's going to be up behind you during a discussion, and make sure that's fact-based and supports what you're trying to say for it. So it's not you personally that's being judged or attacked or questioned. It's the idea. And if you've done your homework, you have it. So you don't have to keep repeating yourself. You can refer to, this portion of the slide, even pointing to a part of it or using something. But I like to have that as my backup when I feel like I'm starting to lose the audience a little bit. And I still may lose them, but at least I know I have a place that succinctly answered the big questions. Now, whether they believe it or not or buy into it, that's a whole nother question. But at least I had something that was a really good summation that could try and get our conversation back on track. And that could say, yes, I heard you, I heard that question, but let's think about all these other things, and sort of my redirect slide to get it back on track. Does that make sense? Oh, you're muted again. You're still muted. There you go. Oh, still can't hear you. It's showing that you're unmuted, but I can't hear your voice for some reason.
That's weird.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much. That's a perfect recommendation. Makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's a really good tool to have and do if you're not comfortable presenting. So we're not talking about presentations today and that presentation styles and what you're comfortable with. This is really about the content of what you have. But let's face it, some of us are more comfortable than others with presenting. That's also a really good option for those that are less comfortable, because you can always refer back to it. It takes more time to prepare Q&As like this. It takes more time to design that one slide you can go back to, but in the end, they can also save your presentation and all the work you've put into it. So those are, to me, very worthwhile things. And we saw it play out in the Corporate Startup Lab capstone. I mean, some of the presentations were 60 slides and wonderful information, but they only had an hour. And so how do you get through the slides? How do you get to the key point? How do you set it up? And when you start to lose people, how do you get them back on track? Because you've got a pretty short amount of time usually. You never have enough time. So how do you keep it as focused as possible?